Welcome to Design As, a show that's intended to speculate on the future of design from a range of different perspectives. Design As is brought to you by MasterCard, a global technology company in the payments industry. Their mission is to connect and power an inclusive digital economy that benefits everyone, everywhere, by making transactions simple, safe, smart, and accessible. To learn more about opportunities within their thriving design community, go to careers.mastercard.com and search for design jobs. This is part 2 of our conversation about culture. Last week when we spoke, we talked about what really is culture, the definition. We also talked about how that term, the term culture, is related to the ideas or the hierarchies between high culture and low culture, where it plays and the kind of distance that it spans. But really, listeners, this should be the first episode you hear, so I encourage you to go back and listen to that first episode. Don't start here, and we'll catch you in about 45 minutes. Let's quickly reintroduce ourselves to this virtual table before we pick things back up. I'm Lee Moreau, founder of Other Tomorrows, a design studio based in Boston. I'm also the host of the Futures Archive, so some of you Design Observer listeners might recognize my voice already, and I'm the professor of practice in design at Northeastern University. With me this morning are my friends. Lesley-Ann, would you mind doing the introduction?
Surely. So my name is Lesley-Ann Noel, and I'm a designer, researcher, and educator. I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, so I'll wave my flag. I'm an assistant professor of design in design studies at North Carolina State University, and I'm the creator, that's a grand word, of the Designer's Critical Alphabet and co-editor of the Black Experience in Design. And I have a new book coming out in November called Design Social Change.
Excellent. Thank you. Next in our little Zoom room here is Alicia Cheng.
My name is Alicia Cheng. I'm a graphic designer and educator, and I'm currently the head of design at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Prior to that, I was a founding member of Management Design with Sarah Gephardt. We were a Brooklyn-based and collaborative women-owned studio. We were doing a lot of work on exhibition design, museum, publications, data visualization, branding, etc. And then in 2020, I wrote a book called This Is What Democracy Looked Like. It's on the visual history of the printed ballot, which was super fun. And I'm happy to be here today.
Thank you, Alicia. And completing our room is Frederick van Amstel. Frederick.
Hi, everybody. I speak from Curitiba, Paraná, Brazil. And I'm currently assistant professor at Federal University of Technology, Paraná, working mainly in the field of experience design and service design. I'm quite curious about the role of technology in mediating, anticipating, and sometimes intensifying or even overcoming oppression, which is one of the contradictions that I study. And I'm always interested on these kind of settings, like we are using technology right now, and there are surely some biases in these technologies, and how can we actually design it for liberating from the oppressive bias? Those are questions that I'm always wondering.
Where I think we should start this week, which is related obviously to what we talked about in part 1, is the service aspect to what we do as designers or design leaders, depending on how you define it, design educators. And maybe a question, I've always thought of design as a service that I give to the world around me. That's just an orientation that I have. I think actually it's shared by many other designers that I tend to associate with and like. And not to get to therapy session here, but I maybe need to question my own way that I think about this and frame it. But I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about the service aspect of what we do as design and how that maybe exists within the framing of who we are versus larger institutions.
I would like to start right away bringing forth the worker perspective. We are designers, but we are also workers, mostly. We don't usually own the companies that we work for. We are not capitalists, mainly, right? And therefore, we have to sell our workforce to the capitalists so we can get our livelihood. And that means that we are serving, because that's the way, the form, the shape of our work takes this world. So we serve a client, but we also serve the client of the client, the user. And that brings forth an interesting contradiction, because sometimes the interest of the user is completely opposite way of the interest of the client who is paying for the service. But are we also serving the ones that are not paying? I guess so. right? And we are always at the crux of these contradictions, having to somehow manage the conflicting of interests and come out with some kind of a compromise. But on the other hand, we could go much further than that and see also society and the public, these general big collective bodies, as someone we are serving to, right? And if you even go further than that, we are serving humanity, right? But then, which part of humanity we are serving? Then the whole things about oppression comes again, the whole material differences. So who gets to have access to the designs that we design? And then are we really serving people that cannot have access to our designs? And then if we get to this first expansive consciousness of, wow, I serve humanity, and the little thing that I design will stay and perhaps one day will be shown in a museum. But then we are also not serving a lot of people that don't have access through consumption or even access to visiting in a museum. And then we come back to that and see that we have limits to our consciousness. And that's why when you have to think about ourselves as part of culture and not as someone who are outside of culture. And the concept of critical consciousness came to my mind. Also, that's something that we may have as a goal as society, to build more critical consciousness of the material culture that we have around us and the role that designers play, but also the role of users in this society. And I learned first this concept from Lesley-Ann Noel. She was using critical consciousness even before me on design education work. So please.
So I started off as an industrial designer, right? So, designing objects. I was a furniture designer. I worked kind of for myself. So I was designer/entrepreneur. I would design collections and try to sell them. And then kind of one day this little light bulb went off. I was like, if my friends can't buy my design, what's the point of this, right? And I think my design practice really dematerialized over many years. If you come back to your original question, which I did not write down, but I wrote down here change agents, possibly as, what are we doing as design? Or the students that I teach today are not in discipline-specific areas of design. They're in design studies. So we have to think in a different way. And I'm trying to teach them about this very grand, about changing the world so that we are serving, like Frederick said, humanity. And we are trying to ensure that we are serving people who typically do not have access or who are underserved. So when we work on a problem, we specifically are trying to identify where are the underserved communities and how can we serve them. So all of our design challenges become about who is least well served and what are their needs and how can we then create something for them. Whereas certainly in my design education, I was trained to serve the people who were paying, whether it was the factory or whatever, and the consumer with the most money. But I'd say 30 years later, my practice has really changed. We're not designing objects. We are trying to design programs and policies. And, even people who are very ambitious in the class might try to design laws. And we are trying to make sure that the populations that are least well served. So that's why we talk about the oppressions as well at the start of the class. So we're trying to identify why these people not being well served. Is it because of racial oppression, gender, disability, ability, access? What is really the oppression that's preventing them from being well served, and how do we address that issue in whatever design challenge we're working on?
I was just going to say, I appreciate the nuance of saying serving the underserved, which leads to, inevitably the audience discussion that I'm sure we've all raised. But fundamentally, I actually hate that word of service. It is so sort of submissive and the posture, I think, is fundamentally wrong and not anything I wouldn't want to endorse. I mean, at the level I am, sort of seeing design as a service is really not the kind of position I would wish to promote. But I don't know if there's a better word per se. Maybe we start qualifying it. Is it public service, as Lesley-Ann was sort of referring to, or because we are serving a need, addressing, solving problems. I think I can use many other verbs and gerunds that come from the word service, but as its own, it bugs me.
No, this is my own particular curse. I'm not saying this is the way that one should live their lives, but it's certainly a way that I self-identify and I see my role as a designer. I'm not saying it's something I would want to teach or continue, but I am attracted because of my own baggage. And I think this goes to everything that Lesley-Ann has in her book about understanding where one comes from. I do have this orientation. It's something I'm trying to work through. And I don't want this to turn into a therapy session. Actually, that would not be the worst use of my time right now, by the way. So, but I appreciate that. But maybe to spring from this, I want to tell a story, which is, okay, so we're talking about, in some sense, our role within classrooms and in institutions where we have audiences, we think about them. But at some point along the way, a bunch of designers maybe got the clever idea that, hey, we have this thing it's proving to be really useful. We're good listeners. I was taking notes here. We are good at problem solving. We're good at facilitation. Gee, shouldn't we really try to change organizations at the top level of institutions, large corporations, et cetera, et cetera? Now design, as I said at the beginning of the show, design has a seat at the table. Even if I self-identify as serving, what if I'm now leading, right? And I think I'd like to kind of maybe flip this from the role of service and work to the role of leading and having real responsibility and what the responsibility comes with. What do we do then?
Well, Alicia mentioned that she had issues with the word service. I have issues with the word leadership. Because we think that change comes from leaders, right? Usually that's the common sense notion, right? And I think that's just part of the story, an even smaller one. Of course, leaders are recognized as leaders if they show the path, a different different way of going. Otherwise, if we just keep going the way we always went, we don't need maybe leader, but leader will show, let's move, let's change our direction. But if no one follows the leader, there's nothing happening, right? And the followers, followership, perhaps much more important, usually in terms of objective numbers. There are always more followers than leaders, right? And if the followers are not following the leader, it doesn't matter. And then I would say there's surely other ways of conceptualizing change that also further away from this distinction between leaders and followers. For example, if everyone is empowered to become a leader at some moment in an organization, for example, in the self-management approach that we employ in our laboratories, where everyone can take the role of a leader anytime, there are no fixed roles, then what's the use of the concept of leadership? Then we have to find other metaphors to describe this kind of change. We usually say that if someone is trying to push forward something, that person is just a pusher. It's not a leader. But if no one is coming with the pusher, then nothing happens. And that's fine. That's really fine. Because if you are not a leader, you don't need to lead. That's the point. If no one follows you, it's fine. It's just not happening because the collective decide that's not important. And then something else that someone else is pushing might happen, not because of that particular person, but because the collective is interested on that. There are more people sharing the motivation for doing what was being pushed. That brings us to a new understanding of the role of designing change society. We may not be the leaders, but although we may be part of these movements of change, that's why I'm also always emphasizing our students to become part of a social movement, if not they are already part of, and bring these social movements into the diversity, into the project, even to the industry practice later on. If you're fighting for human rights in design profession, you are part of a social movement. You just maybe not so conscious about that, but this is how change happens through other means.
What about if not servants or leaders, that, the words that I've heard kind of thrown around. And I've heard Frederick using collaborator and
Complicator.
Complicator, you're right. So something alongside rather, because service maybe implies kind of under and leader is above, but maybe it's a different level, a different tier in the conversation.
I agree. I mean, there's definitely nuances, and I can empathize with Frederick's response to the word leadership. It sort of implies, you are or you aren't. So I think the calibration of how you affect change, how you create activations, can be a very individualized response. There are people personality-wise who don't respond well to that spotlight per se, but they are nevertheless effective in their way. I think remembering that the definitionally, again, as designers, is we make things. So that even if we are at a table that's like a boardroom table or something that's like community engagement, we can listen and learn and we can make stuff. And I think that makes our seat different than others. Whatever that may mean, I think we just also need to remember the making part.
And if we make things, we probably need to stand up from the seat and do things more actively than just sitting at the table and telling people what to do. I think that's not the way...
Right, or just talking about it.
Yeah, it's not even the way design leadership will manifest in this world. If there was something like that, we would be in the lab, in the studio, putting our hands dirty with stuff, right?
Yeah. And or even, I know this is cliched, but we don't need a seat at your table. We'll make our own table because we make things, right? So.
And we don't want to sit down.
Yeah. We make hammocks or we make other things. Yes.
I do see the value of measurement in all of this. And I'm not to get super quantitative, right? But just being aware that this notion of followers, Frederick, that you were talking about, when you see action taking place at a much larger or massive scale, it's indicative of having done something meaningful and creating meaningful change. Where I get concerned is there's oftentimes sort of coercive aspects to getting people to move in a certain direction. I think you're probably seeing that politically when you're talking about Bolsonaro, fascist leader. But there are other types of coercions that take place too. And sort of managing our relationship as designers, whether we're servants, leaders, or collaborators, whatever, with these forces is also complicated. We don't always know what's making the change.
No, we don't know. We won't know. Again, this is a cliche. Change sometimes, there is massive change. And there is that little change that happens from chipping away at a small block or stone. So I am not into measurement, right? You are into measurement. And I am going into this change making with a kind of gut reaction or gut feeling that the trend is supposed to be that change will happen over time, and every now and again something happens that kind of destroys my gut feeling. I'm like, oh, we're supposed to be moving towards cumulatively this more and more and more democratic world. Then yes, something happens to make me wonder. But that's what we say, that's what, people, sociologists, historians, that's what everyone kind of says. And I kind of have to believe it to be able to do this work. I'm not actually trying to measure because I don't know if the measurement will be able to happen in the time frame that I might be working in. So sometimes with the setbacks, as I said, that there are these setbacks that kind of shake the way that I feel about things. But I think that sometimes a setback is actually maybe a galvanizing point or more fuel because maybe people were actually too passive about an issue. And then this little shakeup might happen that actually gets more people energized, and then some other kind of change happens because of that energy.
I think then it would speak to, it's less about metrics, I think, than it is about scale. So if you're speaking more of change on the micro level and change on the macro level, it sort of does reference aspects of what I think is effective leadership in the broader way too. Because if you have elements and movement happening on the micro level, and somebody on the upper level who can recognize that and elevate it, that is effective leadership, I think, and the connection between activity and awareness and those issues to upper levels that can influence and really impact and affect change. So maybe that's just another way to frame it as opposed to metrics, which then sort of fills in, like any more commercial project, you're always asked to sort of, what are the metrics of success? Like, I hate to be the one, that KPI, whatever the performance indicators, like, ew. Like, you can't measure change the way you can't measure culture. You can't. So I think, though, it's the relationship between the micro action and the macro, and that connectivity, I think, is key. Because otherwise, it can just feel like you're never being heard.
You can measure culture, but that might hurt someone who's being measured by it.
Right, who falls outside the measurement.
Because in the human history, there are many times, anytime someone really tries to measure and immobilize culture, because once you measure, you're basically trying to stop this process of this dynamic process that we have been emphasized that is central to culture. But if we set up the numbers, we stick to the numbers as if it was the reality, and we mistake reality for the representation of reality. If reality, culture is always changing, and we say, well, we have measured culture, now we have here the picture of it, reality is running away. And as much as you stay within these numbers, as big will be the difference between what you have measured and what is the reality itself. And I would say that staying in this trouble, and of course we need sometimes the numbers, but we have always to challenge them, not to distrust them, because they are always outdated. Once you get the number, it's already not accurate. It's no longer accurate because we are dealing with human beings. And human beings have this marvelous capacity of changing and developing further. That's what Paulo Freire called ser mais, or becoming more. And if we try to fit people in some clear boundaries, that's what his definition of oppression was. That's becoming less. You cannot become someone else's besides what is expected from a white or a black person. There's already a stereotype for you to follow. And that's part of the great deal of what oppression and how oppression relates to culture, because these structures, for example, the measurements that we create to manage society, they reproduce the same oppression over and over. So it's hard to get outside of the racial division, for example, just to get one example of one racial oppression here.
Hi, I'm Cindy Chastain, Senior Vice President of Customer Experience and Design at MasterCard. And I'd like to introduce you to some design leaders from our growing community.
I'm Greg Brullen, Senior Vice President of Experience and Innovation at MasterCard. I co-lead Customer Experience and Design in the Foundry, leading experience research and insights practice. I think when people think about MasterCard, they think more about payments, they think about credit cards, and we're much more than that today. I think of us more than a credit card company and more as a technology company. So experience research for me is really about understanding what people want, what creates value and relevance for them to actually use something that's going to be meaningful for them. My team in experience research and insights, right? We have experience researchers, we have experience strategists, but ultimately the moniker I have for the team is we've got to design the right thing before you design it right. So that means finding the right problem and then designing the right solutions. And the experience research that we're doing, both generative and evaluative, is kind of new because we don't really know how to move the needle on some of these things. And so it's a great place for design to really experiment. And the more we experiment, the more we're learning. And I think there's a lot more to come in this space.
From new digital payment products to innovations that empower people and create a more inclusive economy, our growing design community is working to accelerate the future of commerce through experience and innovation. Find out more at careers.mastercard.com and search for design jobs.
I kind of want to change the topic a little bit. Let's say after school. So in the professional world, personally in my professional career, I was very frustrated between the reality of professional life coming after academia, where I felt like I was taught certain things and they were no longer welcome in my professional context. So certain skills, value sets, et cetera, that I learned in the confines of a safe academic environment didn't really have an audience within the professional context. This is working as an architect. And where I'm kind of going with this is like, I'm wondering what is the kind of relationship between what we're teaching and what is actually being who we are in that classroom versus who we are in the professional context. And partly like you have to kind of accept that this difference may exist or not. But where is that? Like, who are we putting out there who are we as designers in the professional realm? And how do we think about the culture of design that is kind of, actually making the change in the kind of work mode or collaboration, et cetera?
And I think as an educator, you can only hope that you are helping shape younger talent, towards a manifestation that is satisfying to them. So I think training them to sort of be more self-aware, I mean, not in like a self-conscious type of way, but awareness of themselves and who they bring to any workplace, no matter what their role, I think is so key and sort of character building. So, and all the work I think more directly that Fred and Lesley-Ann are doing. But I think, there are commercial realities for sure. And, if that manifests sometimes where people are just taking money from Google to sort of pay the bills, and then their side gig is like being an activist, not to promote the bifurcation of that. Ideally, you'd like it all in one. But wherever they can find it for whatever suits them, I think is what the end goal should be. Obviously, one wants all of the areas fulfilled in everything one does, but to not stop at if there's not a perfect job or a perfect place or a perfect situation that's explicitly hiring, to find it in other ways. It may not be paid, it may not be glamorous, but sort of keep that fire alive. But the hope is that even if they do a more lucrative job, that they're still bringing their full self to that job. And true, hiring a troublemaker is not always like, on the list of HR qualifications, but an awareness of who you are and your opinions, I think for me, is obviously an added value for the full person.
This notion of self-awareness, I think, is important, and it actually brings me back, Lesley-Ann, to your positionality wheel. For our listeners that don't know, can you describe the positionality wheel conceptually?
Yes. So the idea of examining positionality is something that exists in qualitative research. And I just want to start off there so that people don't think that I created this whole thing of positionality, right? It was just that as a designer, I had never done that, which is I had never had to stop and think about all of these elements of my identity before doing work. So when I learned to be a researcher in a more formal way, I had to write a positionality statement where I wrote a 3-page essay about who I was, what was my history, where was I born, what school did I go to, and I had to reflect on all of these elements of my identity before I started the research that I wanted to do. And what happened is that helped me to see where I might have had some hidden agendas in the way that I was designing the research. And I actually did not change that agenda. It's just that the agenda became public, right? And I could actually declare my background and my identity or my position in the world changed or influences the way that I want to do the research. And I had to write about that. And so what I did is I wanted to create a way that we as designers who maybe are more visual, we don't want to write a 3-page essay. And, was there a way that we could, in an embodied way, that we could do a positionality statement? And then I took 12 elements that people sometimes write about or think about in a positionality statement and place them in this circle, and would have people either individually or in a group identify or reflect on those 12 elements of their identity. So it's race, gender, age, where people were born, the languages that they speak, their education, and a whole lot of other things. And I should emphasize that the elements that you reflect on of your identity will actually change from place to place. So, when I did the positionality wheel once, I led a positionality activity right in the city where Fred is in Curitiba. People ask, well, why didn't I include religion or political values? And I said, well, actually, religion never really came into question in the place that I originally designed the wheel for. And so that's why it wasn't there, right? And so, people might reflect on different elements of their identities in different contexts. But the idea is that our position in the world affects everything that we do. But we actually don't see that position until we really stop to reflect on it. So that's the positionality wheel is one tool to support that. And other people have interesting tools as well. But yeah, it's one tool to make people reflect on their position in the world and then start a discussion about how that might affect the work that they want to do in design or in research in general.
The reason I think it's so important in design is, to Alicia's point, we make things, right? So like designers are the source of so many of the kind of material changes that happen on the planet, and this naturally inflects them. So I really appreciate the model.
Yeah, and I would like to add up to what you had just said. We're not just making things, we are also making ourselves. And positionality wheel and other approaches, they really help us to become aware, self-aware, or even self-conscious about this process of making ourselves while making things for others. And we always imbue our values and also the habits, the cultures, the contradictions that we live in, experience in our life into the things that we put into the world. And as much as we understand where we are grabbing these things out and expressing them, as deep as we were going to contribute to our culture. And I would say that this is probably an overlooked issue in design education. We don't usually think about design education as being citizen training. We think about professional training. But before being a professional, you are a citizen in the world, and understanding your place there and the history of that place and what you can do there besides being a professional. Before that, you're also responsible for so many other things. And learning about your own positionality and its relation to the material culture and, for example, to the material privileges, the positionality will we have tried here as well, but we also emphasized the material privilege that you get from your position there. And for example, did you ever had such a kind of ergonomic chair that you are sitting right now? Or which kind of design had you had access to throughout your life? And this impacts the limits the kind of person you can make yourself, because you make yourself based on the materials that are around you and the design of things, or even the undesigned things like the gambiarras that I was mentioning at the beginning of our conversation. If you make yourself out of a gambiarra, can you really become a designer? Or which kind of designer will you become if you design based on gambiarra and then you make a statement, look, this is still design? This kind of more broader design education is pretty much needed right now because, as Lesley-Ann mentioned, there are not many jobs, self-secured jobs for all students, but there's definitely a society in need of people that can handle these harsh contradictions, and they can create other roles for being in society, which is not necessarily the professional role. For example, the activist that Alicia was once mentioned. This is also a great way of being a designer in the world.
I also think that the roles don't have to be that clearly defined. It's not like you're an activist or not an activist type of thing. But I think what you're speaking of, and I think as, having probably mostly like younger students, it's that experience of how to calibrate, how to use those tools. Like you are always trying to bring your full self to every project you do. But, in terms of there's a client relationship with a lot of commercial work, and they're the ones that give you the brief that you respond to. And if you insert yourself and then get maybe dismissed because that's not what they want, I think recognizing that doesn't mean rejection per se, that maybe that lives somewhere else, for someone else, for yourself. So I think just sort of keeping that consistent hope alive that you can still manage to still be your own person and your own designer and maintain your voice. But sometimes one has to learn how to listen to the room, make the money, get the job done. But that doesn't mean it should come at the expense of your own identity and your goals.
Design is, through this conversation, design is moving. Design is evolving. It's an action. It's a verb, right? We've kind of also established that culture is also moving and is evolving and forming, and we're a party to that. Where do we see the future of the relationship between design and culture? Where are we going?
I mean, to sound really hackneyed, I think about this pluriverse and the world of many worlds, and I think about social change. These are the two buzzwords that I use, buzz phrases that I use all the time. But, when I think of this question of how design meets, shapes, or interacts with culture, that's a very anthropological, I think, type of question. And a lot of the work that we do as designers is anthropological. So, maybe it's continuing that one of us used, not me, one of you used the word curiosity at some stage, and it's us maintaining that curiosity and recording, documenting, supporting, being part of this culture and creating culture. And, I think that's what we continue to do in the future. But you also are asking, what does it need to change? I think maybe what I would utopically like to see change is, I think sometimes when we talk about design and culture, it sounds a lot like this remote thing and, high culture, that idea of, again, maybe framing culture, helping people to see culture. And the future I would like to see is that maybe design is coming down. Up and down is kind of, these aren't great terms, but that it's coming closer to meeting that popular culture, right? Or becoming part of that popular culture in the future.
I would also say that a sort of concern in terms of who endorses elements of design as a practice. So I totally agree with efforts to be as expansive and inclusive as possible, empowering students to understand that they are part of a broader rubric that allows them to call themselves designers. And yet on the flip side, I feel like you have a lot of people who are like, oh, I love design, so I can blank or whatever. So there's a lot of people in our space. And not to at all sound exclusionary, but I wonder where those thresholds are. Are there thresholds? If they're not, how do those of us who, is school the only mandate for what terms a designer, definitionally there's a lot of degrees out there that have the word design in them. Does that make people a designer? What is that now? So I think the blurring of the lines are excellent, but it also has its, we won't know exactly, but I think we are seeing a much more pervasive use of the term, and we see it as an empowerment and being able to sit at more tables. But I just wonder if the next step may be somewhat of a recalibration potentially, but where those metrics and parameters lie, I do not know.
Yeah, I don't think there's a universal definition of design that exists that looks anything like what we would have seen a few decades ago, or certainly when I was in school. Terry Irwin at Carnegie Mellon said something to me recently, and she might have been quoting Herbert Simon or somebody else, but it was sort of like, yeah, we all design, but some of us do it professionally. And it's like, okay, that is a distinction that is helpful on some level, just to, if you're doing it for others, that already is it's sort of a leap that one has to take.
Maybe it goes back to the making things part,
And for whom, yes, or with whom. And of course, that could be a whole other conversation, which maybe we should have in a second. So this is a bit of an experiment. One part of the experiment is having multiple people on a podcast and try to frame a conversation. We're doing this remotely. We're all in literally different parts of the world. And to try to have this synthetic dialogue. But one of the bigger questions I have is I want to make sure that, or how can we ensure that we're not having the same old design conversation that we would have had before? Are we just repeating old territory? What is there a sense of progress? So we were talking about redefining design or what that means, or what are the limits? How do we feel about that?
Yeah, I think it's so much about communication and being able to have the dialogue from very different perspectives and all that means. And I love the idea that it's shaping towards design and designers within that rubric as a collective. We're not always going the same way per se, but we are a collective in spirit and in practice and in, so I think there is alignment, even though we want to make sure that there's room for every individual. So I appreciate that seems to be where we're poised, and forums like this can enable those discussions.
Yeah, and to the question, are we asking the same questions or having the same conversations? The answer might be yes. I think The answer is often yes to that, because we do have to have the same conversations and ask the same questions. Some of the questions we ask today are the same questions that we were asking 30 years ago when I was a student, and probably 60 years ago when my professors were students. But every time we ask these questions, we come away with a new configuration of ideas that we can then act on in some way. And then ask the same question again next week.
What will the questions be in 20 years? That's another one. So I think the questions have changed, and I don't think we're retreading too much. I think there's much more reaction of what I think, again, being broad, may not have been as probing or as self-examining. The level of self-examination is different now than it was before. And again, I don't know what we all are terming before, but I think we have a sense. So I do feel like the questions are different now.
Well, I think if we would have talked about design having, the beginning of this conversation was design has a seat at the table. There's a sense that there's an altitude at which design is playing that is different than it was before.
Well, I think that that's a question that we will repeat forever and ever and ever. It is that the table might change, or the way the table is configured might change, or the context might change. So when I was a student in Brazil or when I lived in Trinidad, the question, again, might have been the same question, does design have a seat at the table? But actually, it's a different question. Does that make sense? Because the context is different, right? So when I say that it's the same questions that we will continue to ask, I think that, yes, we will ask these questions over and over again. We will ask from now till eternity, what is design? And we'll ask questions like, who should design? But the way that we respond to the questions will be different.
If I'm hearing you right, to some degree, we have permission to redefine the context. And we all are agreeing that that's an acceptable thing to say, which probably is relatively new.
Yeah, I think it's great to ask the same questions, actually. I don't think that there's any issue with that. And like Alicia said, there'll be different questions as well, which we will also ask because things have changed and reconfigured. And we've thought about things differently, and that will encourage us to ask different questions as well.
If we're having a dialogue, we are already undoing and unlearning the way you have been taught design and the way we have seen in conferences and in magazines where someone is talking and others are just listening, a monologue basically. And we had this marvelous horizontal circular or around the world dialogue here that is already hinting on the new avenues that designing are going towards. The pluriversality concept that Lesley-Ann is pushing forth in the community is really all about this, listening more than what talking, and being part of a collective that's trying to figure out something that is always ahead of itself. We can never define which worlds are in the pluriverse. That's why we say many. And we can never define all the concepts of culture, we said many, and also concepts of design. And that's fine. And then throughout this dialogue, we make sense of it. And no one of us have a full picture of it. And that's also fine. And then we keep having these discussions. We get engaged with the discussion because we know that we will never know alone. And then there's always an opening for the next conversation, next gathering, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, this was really a great conversation. Thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedules and the beginning of semesters and all kinds of other things to spend time in this conversation. I'd love to just hear what you're up to and give you a chance to kind of tell us how you'd like us to learn more about you.
I'm really not on Instagram so much, but we're doing a lot of activity here at the museum, so there's always something to see. So you can always visit the Met when you're in New York.
Thank you. And Lesley-Ann, where can we find out more about you? And tell us about your book.
Okay, so I am kind of easy to find on Instagram and LinkedIn. And yes, I have a book coming out at the end of November. It is called Design Social Change, Take Action with Equity and Challenge the Status Quo at the end of November. In that book, people will kind of see what some of the conversations in my contemporary issues class are about, because it is about, getting people to think about the world. It's about kind of building collective change, getting people to look at themselves first and understand what they're bringing to issues, letting them reflect on the issues that they're passionate about, and then having them dream about worlds that they want to build. Because again, that's what we do as designers. We make things, and things include worlds, and then find other people to build these worlds with them. So I hope people enjoy it.
Fantastic. Congratulations there. Frederick, how can we find out more about you?
You can generally find my social network profiles directly on my personal website, which is fredvanamstel.com. But what I'm up to? Well, I'm up to moving to the US. Soon I'm going to become associate professor of University of Florida.
Congratulations. And you can keep up with me, Lee Moreau, at othertomorrows.com or on LinkedIn. Design As is a podcast from Design Observer. To keep up with the show, go to designobserver.com/designaz or subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you liked what you heard today, please make sure to rate and review us and share it with your friends. You can follow Design Observer on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Design Observer. Design As is brought to you this season by MasterCard. Thanks again to our brilliant roundtable, Lesley-Ann Noel, Alicia Cheng, and Frederick van Amstel. You can find out more about them in our show notes at designobserver.com/designaz, along with a full transcription of this show. Our producer is Adina Karp. Judy Bell-Kamenian edits the show. Special thanks to Grupo Onion in Brazil, Megan Gerald and Jason Gillikin and Raleigh at Earfluence, and Maxine Philivong here at Northeastern University. Our music is by Joshua Brown. Thanks as always to Design Observer founder Jessica Helfand and to Design Observer executive producer Betsy Vardell.